Mickey Cohen. On July 28, 1961, a man walked into Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary who had survived 2 assassination attempts, stared down the United States Senate, and once kept Frank Sinatra on speed dial. His name was Mickey Cohen, and the federal government had just handed him the largest white-collar prison sentence in American history, longer than the one they gave Al Capone. The catch was, Cohen had never been convicted of murder. Not once. Meyer Harris Cohen was born September 4, 1913, in Brooklyn, New York, to Max and Fanny Cohen, Russian Jewish immigrants from Kiev. His father died when he was young, and the family packed up and moved to the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles, where his older brothers ran a pharmacy that doubled as a Prohibition-era bootleg outlet. Cohen sold newspapers on the street, fought in illegal underground prize fights as a kid, and by 15, he had run east to chase a professional boxing career, fighting in Cleveland, the Midwest, and New York. He lost a match to featherweight champion Tommy Paul and realized the ring was not going to make him rich. By his late teens, he was working as a hired enforcer for the Cleveland mob, then for the Chicago outfit. He later claimed to have met Al Capone, though historians point out that Capone was already in federal prison by the time Cohen showed up in Chicago in 1934. After a violent armed robbery dispute went sideways, Cohen returned to Los Angeles in 1937 and aligned himself with Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. When Siegel was murdered in 1947, Cohen inherited control of the West Coast rackets. He survived a shooting at Sherry's Cafe in 1949 and a bombing at his own Brentwood home in 1950, and he became one of LA's most photographed gangsters, running in circles with Sinatra, Robert Mitchum, and Sammy Davis Jr. The Kefauver Senate hearings of 1950 to 51 dragged him in front of the cameras and led to his first tax evasion conviction, a 4-year federal sentence. After his release, he went right back to gambling, blackmail, and public spectacle. He brokered the Lana Turner and Johnny Stompanato love letter scandal in 1958 and seemed to enjoy the attention more than the money. Then, in 1961, with Attorney General Robert Kennedy personally pushing the case, Cohen was convicted again of attempting to evade federal income tax and sentenced to 15 years. They sent him straight to Alcatraz. He became, by his own boast, the only inmate in the history of the island ever released on appeal bond, freed on October 17, 1961, by an order signed by a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice. That alone is remarkable. But after his appeals failed, he was returned to custody and arrived back at Alcatraz on May 14, 1962, as Register Number 1518, residing in cell B226 on the second tier of B Block, the stretch known as Michigan Avenue. His inmate file shows he made what they called a good adjustment. He read constantly books on philosophy, mathematics, poetry, English usage, biography, and travel. He spent his recreation time playing cards. The cell house officer recorded one of the most quoted observations of his time there, writing that Cohen was a man apt at getting what he wanted by any means open to him. The Protestant chaplain noted that he was friendly and cooperative. His sister and wife told staff he would rather take a beating himself than see another person get hurt. Among other inmates, Cohen carried the aura of an old-line celebrity gangster, but he conspicuously refused to act tough. He obeyed the rules while expecting the deference of a king. In January 1963, just weeks before the prison closed for good, Cohen was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. And that is where things got ugly. On August 14, 1963, a fellow inmate named Burrell Estes McDonald struck Cohen from behind with a 3-foot iron pipe while Cohen sat in a radio and television repair class. The blow shattered his skull. Surgeons spent hours removing bone fragments from hemorrhaged brain tissue. After a 2-week coma, doctors installed a steel plate. Cohen survived, but he was left partially paralyzed, walking with a limp and using a cane for the rest of his life. He was finally released on January 6, 1972. Hobbled and frail, he toured the country, gave television interviews, visited New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello, and spoke out against prison abuse. He died in his sleep on July 29, 1976, of stomach cancer, at age 62, in Los Angeles. His criminal record showed 0 murder convictions, only failing to pay Uncle Sam. His legacy is a strange one. A Jewish-American mob boss who outshone his Italian counterparts in glamour, the only man ever bailed off Alcatraz, and a gangster who, in his own words, never fooled with Uncle Sam on income tax, and somehow always did. But if Mickey Cohen was the most glamorous man to walk through those gates, the next name on this list might be the most dangerous. Whitey Bulger. For 16 years, one of the most wanted fugitives in America lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica, California, 2 blocks from the beach, with 30 weapons and over $800,000 in cash hidden in the walls. His name was James Whitey Bulger, and by the time the FBI finally caught him in 2011, he was 81 years old. He had been running since 1994, and the story of how he ended up on the rock is just as disturbing as the story of how he left it. James Joseph Bulger Jr. was born September 3, 1929, in Everett, Massachusetts, the second of 6 children. His father was a Newfoundland-born union laborer who had lost an arm in an industrial accident, and the family scraped by in the Old Harbor housing project in South Boston. Local police nicknamed the blonde-haired boy Whitey, a name he hated for the rest of his life. He preferred Jim, Jimmy, or Boots, after his habit of pulling a switchblade from his cowboy boot. By 14, he had been arrested for larceny. By his late teens, he had joined a South Boston street gang called the Shamrocks and racked up charges for assault, forgery, and armed robbery. He joined the U.S. Air Force in April 1948, where he was court-martialed for assaults and arrested for going AWOL in 1950, yet still somehow received an honorable discharge in 1952. Back in Boston, he graduated to armed bank robbery. On May 17, 1955, Bulger and 2 accomplices took $42,112 from the Industrial National Bank in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. 6 months later, he hit another bank in Melrose, Massachusetts. He was arrested and on July 20, 1956, received a 20-year federal sentence, beginning at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. This is where the story turns into something out of a nightmare. In 1957, Bulger volunteered with 18 other inmates for what they were told was medical research into a cure for schizophrenia in exchange for reduced sentences. The program was actually the CIA's MK-Ultra experiments, supervised by Dr. Carl Pfeiffer of Emory University. Over roughly 18 months, Bulger was dosed with LSD more than 50 times. He later wrote of auditory and visual hallucinations and violent nightmares that haunted him until the day he died. In letters to a juror after his 2013 trial, he described how on the rock he felt at times sure he was going insane, that sleep was full of violent nightmares, and he would wake up every hour or so, and that it had been that way since '57. On the back of a photograph from that era, he wrote that by the end of Alcatraz he was getting more serious and capable of about anything, and that hard time makes hard people. After participating in escape planning at Atlanta, Bulger was transferred and arrived at Alcatraz on November 2, 1959, as inmate number 1428. His first cell, C-145, sat along Broadway, where he met Clarence Joe Carnes, the Choctaw Kid from the 1946 Battle of Alcatraz, who became a close friend. Bulger weight-trained, took correspondence courses in typing, bookkeeping, and business law, and read constantly poetry, military history, and politics. He was considered soft-spoken and disciplined. Years later, he reportedly told Alcatraz historian Michael Esslinger that if he could choose his own epitaph, it would read that he would rather be in Alcatraz. And before going on the run in 1994, Bulger and his girlfriend, Teresa Stanley, actually visited the closed prison as tourists, walking through his old cell block. Bulger was transferred to Leavenworth in 1962 and Lewisburg in 1963, and was paroled in 1965 after 9 years. Free for 46 years, he rose through the Killeen Gang to lead the Winter Hill Gang, became an FBI informant against the rival Patriarcha crime family in 1975, and built a brutal South Boston empire of murder, extortion, drug trafficking, and racketeering. Tipped off by his corrupt FBI handler John Connolly in December 1994, Bulger fled and remained on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list until his June 22, 2011 capture in Santa Monica at age 81. Convicted in August 2013 on 31 counts, including involvement in 11 murders, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. And somehow, it gets worse. On October 30, 2018, hours after his transfer to USP Hazleton in Brewston Mills, West Virginia, the 89-year-old wheelchair-bound Bulger was beaten to death by inmates Fotios Freddy Gayas and Paul DeCollegiero. His death certificate cited blunt force injuries of the head. The man who had survived MK Ultra, who had run the most feared gang in Boston, who had evaded the FBI for 16 years, was dead within hours of arriving at a new prison. His MK Ultra experience formed the basis of a posthumous lawsuit and a juror's public regret about her vote to convict. Bulger spent his life becoming the kind of man Alcatraz was designed to break. The rock did not break him. It refined him. And the story of the next man on this list proves that even the most powerful criminal empire in American history was no match for a disease nobody could see coming. Al Capone. There is a version of Al Capone that everyone knows. The pinstripe suits, the Tommy guns, the St. Valentine's Day massacre. But the version of Capone that matters for this story is the one most people never talk about. The version sitting in an Alcatraz hospital bed, confused, paranoid, unable to remember his own name. That is what The Rock did to Al Capone. Or more accurately, that is what Al Capone did to himself. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, the fourth of 9 children of Neapolitan immigrants, Gabriel, a barber, and Teresa Capone. He left school at 14 after striking a teacher, then worked as a candy store clerk and bowling alley pin boy while running with the 5 Points gang under mentor Johnny Torrio. In 1919, he followed Torrio to Chicago and became a bouncer in a Levee District brothel. Almost certainly there, in his early 20s, he contracted the syphilis that would eventually kill him. Capone never sought treatment. He was reportedly terrified of needles. That detail, a gangster afraid of a needle, would come back to define everything. In Chicago, he absorbed Torrio's bootlegging empire after Torrio's 1925 retirement and built the Chicago outfit into a syndicate making an estimated $100 million a year. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929, 7 members of Bugs Moran's North Side Gang gunned down in a garage, defined his reign of terror, though Capone was never charged. On June 5, 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion for the years 1925 through 1929. He was convicted of 3 counts in October 1931 and sentenced to 11 years, $50,000 in fines and court costs. He entered the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in May 1932, where his cell reportedly sported personal bedding, a carpet, a radio, and a constant flow of visitors, to such excess that officials ordered him transferred. On August 22, 1934, Capone arrived at the newly federalized Alcatraz with 52 other inmates by sealed railroad car. Warden James A. Johnston recognized him immediately in the line, grinning and making comments out of the side of his mouth. Johnston curtly assigned him inmate number 85 and ordered him back in line. Capone tried to negotiate privileges. Johnston denied them all. Capone eventually conceded, reportedly telling Johnston that it looked like Alcatraz had gotten him licked. He was assigned ordinary work, sweeping, mopping, the laundry, and lived in B Block. Despite his celebrity, he attempted no escape, and his record carried no major disciplinary action. Capone joined the prison's inmate band, the Rock Islanders, where he played banjo and the mandola. He transcribed a tune called Madonna Mia for his wife. He read constantly and wrote affectionate letters home, one to his son closing with a reminder to keep up the way he was doing and not let anything get him down. Signed with love and kisses from his dear dad Alphonse Capone, number 85. In the recreation yard, he played handball, baseball, horseshoes, checkers, and dominoes. One fellow inmate told reporters that Capone got no more privileges than anyone else, except that he did not get beaten or thrown into the dungeon because he had too much political influence for that. But Capone could not outrun what was already inside him. On June 23, 1936, fellow inmate James C. Lucas stabbed him with a pair of barber's shears while Capone stood waiting for a haircut in the basement. The wound was superficial. He also fought with an inmate in the yard and spent 8 days in isolation. By February 1938, prison doctors formally diagnosed neurosyphilis, syphilis of the brain, and declared him mentally unfit. He spent his last year in the Alcatraz hospital wing, confused and disoriented, with episodes of paranoia, slurred speech, and behavior that disturbed even hardened inmates and guards. Doctors attempted experimental fever therapies, injecting him with malaria and with bismuth and triparsamide. None of it worked. Capone completed his Alcatraz sentence on January 6, 1939, was transferred to Terminal Island in Southern California to finish a 1-year contempt sentence, and was paroled November 16, 1939. Johns Hopkins refused to admit him. Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore accepted him. He retired to his Palm Island, Florida estate, and in 1942 became one of the first civilians treated with the new wonder drug penicillin. It slowed, but did not reverse the brain damage. By the end, doctors estimated his mental capacity at that of a 12-year-old. He suffered a stroke on January 21, 1947, and died of cardiac arrest on January 25, 1947, at age 48. A man who had once commanded an empire but ended a powerless recluse, broken not by rivals or G-men, but by an inability to face a doctor. The most powerful gangster of the 20th century, undone by a needle he refused to take. And no, That is not something made up for dramatic effect. That is exactly what happened. The next man on this list was also destroyed by isolation, but unlike Capone, he turned his cage into a laboratory. Robert Stroud. Most people know him from the movie. Burt Lancaster in a quiet cell, surrounded by canaries, a gentle genius finding redemption through science. The real Robert Stroud was nothing like that. He was a double murderer, a diagnosed psychopath, and a man so dangerous that the federal government kept him in solitary confinement for 42 years. He also happened to be a legitimate scientific mind. And the strangest part of his story is that the famous Birdman of Alcatraz never kept a single bird on Alcatraz. Robert Franklin Stroud was born January 28, 1890, in Seattle, Washington. His father was a violent alcoholic. At 13, Stroud ran away from home and drifted north to the Alaska Territory. By 18, he was living with a 36-year-old woman named Kitty Dulaney in the rough towns of Juneau and Catala. On January 18, 1909, Stroud shot and killed a bartender named F.K. Charlie Dahmer, who had allegedly beaten Dulaney over an unpaid debt. Convicted of manslaughter, he was shipped to the federal penitentiary at McNeil Island, sentenced to 12 years. There he stabbed a fellow inmate who had reported him for trying to obtain narcotics, and 6 months were added to his sentence. He was transferred in 1912 to Leavenworth, Kansas. At Leavenworth, on March 26, 1916, after his brother was turned away during a visit, Stroud walked into the mess hall in front of 1,100 inmates and stabbed prison guard Andrew Turner to death. Convicted of first-degree murder, he was sentenced to hang. On April 15, 1920, after his mother Elizabeth's tireless lobbying, President Woodrow Wilson commuted his sentence to life imprisonment without parole, to be served in permanent solitary confinement. And then something nobody expected. In the Leavenworth yard around 1920, Stroud found a nest with 3 injured sparrows, and a self-education began. He acquired canaries, eventually keeping up to 300 birds in 2 adjoining segregation cells. He read every ornithology book he could obtain and made original observations on avian disease, particularly hemorrhagic septicemia. He published Diseases of Canaries in 1933, and his major work, Stroud's Digest of the Diseases of Birds, came in 1943, a massive illustrated volume that became a standard reference in the field for decades. He ran a mail-order canary medicine business through his mother, then through his wife, Della Mae Jones, a canary breeder he married in 1933. This decision to study birds seemed small at the time. It was not. It would define how the entire world remembered him, and it would make the truth of who he actually was almost impossible for the public to accept. But behind the bird expert persona was a deeply violent man. In 1942, prison officials discovered that some of his laboratory equipment was being used to distill alcohol. Citing his dangerous tendencies and the unsanitary conditions of his cell, they initiated transfer. On December 16, 1942, with only 10 minutes' notice and no chance to say goodbye to his birds, which were sent to his brother, Stroud arrived at Alcatraz as inmate number 594. He never kept a single bird on the island. As one prison historian put it, the famous Birdman of Alcatraz never had a bird the entire 17 years he was there. Robert Stroud was actually the Birdman of Leavenworth. On Alcatraz, he was just prisoner number 594. That is not a typo, by the way. 17 years on the rock without a single feather. In 1943, Alcatraz psychiatrist Romney M. Ritchie diagnosed him as a psychopath with an IQ of 112. Stroud spent 6 years in segregation in D Block, then 11 years in the prison hospital wing. He wrote 2 more manuscripts, an autobiography called Bobby, and a detailed history and critique of the United States prison system, from colonial times through the formation of the Bureau of Prisons. A judge ruled he had the right to write them, but upheld the warden's ban on publication. Guards and contemporaries regarded him not as the gentle figure of legend, but as a manipulative, calculating, and dangerous man. In 1955, former corrections officer Thomas E. Gaddis published the biography Birdman of Alcatraz, which led to John Frankenheimer's 1962 film of the same name, with Burt Lancaster in the title role. Stroud was never permitted to see it. He was transferred in 1959 to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, where he finally worked in the print shop. He died there of natural causes on November 21, 1963, discovered by his close friend, convicted spy Morton Sobel. He had been imprisoned for 54 years, 42 of them in solitary confinement. One Alcatraz inmate famously dismissed the late campaign to free him by saying that the people pushing for his pardon did not want to pardon Robert Stroud. They wanted to pardon Burt Lancaster. Stroud's final irony came at the Academy Awards. Lancaster lost Best Actor to Gregory Peck for To Kill a Mockingbird. The public got the Hollywood version. The men who lived with him knew the colder truth. Every man on this list so far had power stripped away from him on the rock. The next man brought something to Alcatraz that could not be taken: dignity. Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson. In the summer of 1963, the same year Alcatraz closed its doors for good, a man walked out of federal prison and was met on the streets of Harlem with what amounted to a parade. No floats, no marching band, just hundreds of people lining the sidewalks to welcome back the only gangster who had ever stood up to the white mob and negotiated a peace with honor. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, and everybody in Harlem called him Bumpy. Johnson was born October 31, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, to William and Margaret Moultrie Johnson. He earned the nickname Bumpy from a small, bony protrusion on the back of his head. When Johnson was 10, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. Fearing lynch mob reprisal, his parents mortgaged their home to send Willie north, and by 1919 dispatched the short-tempered 14-year-old Bumpy to live with his sister Mabel in Harlem. Mocked for his southern accent and small stature, Johnson learned to fight back fast. He swept storefronts, ran numbers, shot pool, and was eventually recruited by gangster William "Bub" Hewlett as a bodyguard for high-profile rackets bosses. By 1932, after several short prison stints, Johnson had been taken under the wing of Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen, Harlem's reigning policy rackets boss. As her bodyguard and chief enforcer, Johnson fought a guerrilla war against Dutch Schultz's white mob for control of Harlem's numbers rackets, a conflict that by his wife Mamie Hatcher's later account produced more than 40 deaths and several kidnappings. After Schultz was assassinated on Lucky Luciano's orders in 1935, Johnson negotiated a peace settlement with the Italians. Luciano took a cut. Johnson kept Harlem. His wife later wrote that it was not a perfect solution, and not everyone was happy, but the people of Harlem realized Bumpy had ended the war with no further losses and had negotiated a peace with honor, because for the first time, a black man had stood up to the white mob instead of just bowing down. Bumpy and Luciano were sometimes seen playing chess together at the YMCA on 135th Street. You would think someone would have said something about a black gangster playing chess with the most powerful Italian mob boss in America. Nobody did. It was just how Bumpy operated. Johnson became the de facto godfather of Harlem, mentor to Frank Lucas, and quiet partner to the Genovese crime family. He gave away Thanksgiving turkeys, hosted Christmas parties, paid neighborhood children's school fees, and urged young people to finish school. Robin Hood imagery his community embraced completely. In 1951, federal indictments swept up his heroin operation. In 1952, he was sentenced to 15 years for narcotics conspiracy. After exhausting his appeals, he was sent to Alcatraz in 1954 as inmate number 1117, one of the very few black organized crime figures ever held on the island, which was still dominated by Depression-era outlaws and white mobsters. At Alcatraz, Johnson was a study in composure. Guards and inmates alike noted his calm bearing, his refusal to swagger, and his sharp intellect. He was a serious reader, comfortable quoting Shakespeare, and a skilled chess player. He reportedly wrote poetry that was later published in Harlem magazines. He was not associated with violence on the rock, drawing a respect rooted in intellect rather than fear. By the standards of his era, he was an anomaly. A black inmate whose authority among other prisoners derived from neither muscle nor intimidation, but from sheer presence. There is no record of any escape attempt or significant disciplinary incident during his Alcatraz years. He was released in 1963, the same year the Rock closed, and returned to New York, to that impromptu welcome through the streets of Harlem. He took up his old life uneasily. The Harlem he had ruled was no longer the same neighborhood, and the heroin trade had metastasized in his absence. He maintained a famous friendship with Malcolm X, offering protection that Malcolm declined for image reasons, and he continued to advise the next generation of Harlem operators, including Frank Lucas. Though his wife Mamie later wrote that Lucas's portrayal in the 2007 film American Gangster was largely fictional, and that Lucas was not present at Johnson's death. On July 7, 1968, shortly before 2 in the morning, Bumpy Johnson was sitting in Wells Restaurant in Harlem, under federal indictment again, having ordered a chicken leg, hominy grits, and coffee. He clutched his chest and collapsed, dying of congestive heart failure in the arms of his childhood friend Junie Bird. He was 62. Buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, he has since been the subject of films including Shaft, The Cotton Club, Hoodlum, American Gangster, and the long-running Epix and MGM Plus series Godfather of Harlem, in which Forrest Whitaker plays Johnson's post-Alcatraz years. He is buried under a simple stone in a city he never stopped trying to protect. And unlike every other man on this list, Bumpy Johnson left Alcatraz with the same thing he walked in with: his name intact. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Alvin Creepy Karpis. The longest sentence ever served on Alcatraz belonged to a man who had no fingerprints, who once made J. Edgar Hoover fly across the country just to pretend he had made the arrest, and who, years later, sat in a prison cell on McNeil Island giving guitar lessons to a young inmate named Charles Manson. His name was Alvin Karpis, and he spent 26 years on the rock. Nobody else came close. Alvin Francis Karpis was born Alban Francis Karpovicius on August 10, 1907, in Montreal, Quebec, to Lithuanian immigrants John and Anna Karpovicius. Raised in Topeka, Kansas, he was running with gamblers, bootleggers, and pimps before he was a teenager. By 1926, he had been committed to the Kansas State Industrial Reformatory at Hutchinson, from which he promptly escaped. Recaptured for auto theft, he was sent to the state prison at Lansing, where he met Fred Barker. Released in 1931, he joined Fred and his brothers Doc, Herman, and Lloyd, and their mother Kate, known as Ma Barker, forming the Barker-Karpis gang. Through 1932 to 1934, the gang executed a string of bank robberies, an armored car heist, and a train robbery worth roughly $27,000. Then, they moved into kidnapping. William Ham Jr. of the Ham Brewing fortune, in June 1933, $100,000 ransom. The banker Edward G. Bremer Jr. in January 1934, $200,000 ransom. Bremer's father was a personal friend of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who denounced the crime in a fireside chat, triggering an unprecedented federal manhunt. Doc Barker tried to alter his face and remove his fingerprints with the help of underworld physician Dr. Joseph Moran in 1934. The surgery was disastrous, leaving recognizable scars. The gang later murdered Moran for talking. After Ma and Fred Barker were killed in a Florida shootout on January 16, 1935, Karpis became the FBI's public enemy number one, and the only one of the four men to ever hold that title who was taken alive. Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson had all been killed. Then came one of the most embarrassing episodes in FBI history. In April 1936, Hoover was humiliated at a Senate appropriations hearing by Tennessee Senator Kenneth McKellar, who pointed out that the director himself had never personally made an arrest. Hoover flew to New Orleans on May 1, 1936, where agents had cornered Karpis outside an apartment. The official FBI account claims Hoover personally reached into Karpis's Plymouth coupe to grab a rifle from the back seat. There was just one problem. The Plymouth did not have a back seat. None of the agents had brought handcuffs, so Karpis was tied with an agent's necktie. Karpis himself later wrote that Hoover only emerged from behind a building after other agents had already seized him. Sentenced to life for the Ham kidnapping, Karpis arrived at Alcatraz in August 1936 as inmate number 325. He spent 26 years there, the longest sentence ever served on the Rock, broken only by a 6-month transfer to Leavenworth in 1958. He worked mainly in the bakery, was known for frequent fights with other inmates, and was far from a model prisoner. Yet he never participated in any escape attempt. He was rumored to laugh out loud when the Ham's beer jingle played on radio broadcasts of baseball games in the cell house in the late 1950s. The very brewery whose family he had once kidnapped. And no, that is not made up. In April 1962, with Alcatraz being decommissioned, Karpis was transferred to McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State. There he met a young inmate doing time for car theft and pimping named Charles Manson. Karpis gave Manson guitar lessons. He later wrote in his 1980 memoir On the Rock that the kid approached him requesting music lessons, saying he wanted to learn guitar and become a music star. Karpis described Manson as so lazy and shiftless that he doubted the kid would put in the time required to learn. Manson told Karpis he would be bigger than the Beatles and asked for an introduction to Las Vegas nightclub contacts. Karpis declined. After persistent lobbying by Washington attorney James E. Carty, who took his case for free and battled Hoover's personal interference at parole hearings, Karpis was paroled in 1969 and deported to Canada. He settled in Montreal, later moved to Spain, and published 2 memoirs. On August 26, 1979, he was found dead in Torremolinos, Spain, of a sleeping pill overdose. Originally ruled a suicide, the death has also been described as accidental. He was 72. According to his ghostwriter Robert Livesey, Karpis once babysat in Toronto for the future actors Neve and Christian Campbell. Karpis outlasted the rock itself. He walked in when it was new and was still there when they started shutting off the lights. And the man who tried to escape before Karpis even arrived did not get nearly as lucky. Arthur Doc Barker. On the morning of Friday the 13th, January 1939, guards at Alcatraz found 5 empty cells in D block. The fog was so thick, the lighthouse log confirmed near zero visibility. The foghorn had been blowing continuously since 10:15 the night before. Somewhere on the western shore of the island, a man named Doc Barker was bleeding out on the rocks, still trying to tie driftwood together into a raft. He never made it off the island. He is one of only 2 inmates known to have died during an active escape attempt from Alcatraz. Arthur R. Doc Barker was born June 4, 1899, in Aurora, Missouri, the 3rd son of George and Kate Ma Barker. He grew up in Webb City, Missouri, and later Tulsa, Oklahoma, in poverty alongside brothers Herman, Lloyd, and Fred. By his late teens, he was already in trouble. Arrested July 4, 1918, for car theft in Tulsa. Arrested February 19, 1920, in Joplin, Missouri. Involved on August 16, 1921, in the killing of night watchman Thomas J. Sherrill at St. John's Hospital in Tulsa. For the Sherrill murder, Barker received a life sentence at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. After his mother lobbied for years, Governor William J. Holloway paroled him in September 1932. He immediately rejoined his brother Fred and Alvin Karpis to launch the Barker-Karpis gang. The gang's rampage covered the Ham kidnapping of June 1933 and the Bremer kidnapping of January 1934. And the Bremer job produced one of the dumbest blunders in gangland history. As Barker and other gang members released Bremer in February 1934, they stopped to refuel from a hidden gas can. The freezing night, gloves, and a fumbled can left Doc Barker's fingerprint clearly preserved on the metal. A print FBI agents would later use to break the case wide open. In 1934, he and Fred underwent disastrous plastic surgery and fingerprint removal by Dr. Joseph Moran. The results left them scarred, infected, and still recognizable. The gang then murdered Moran when he began boasting to a prostitute. On January 8, 1935, FBI agents under Melvin Purvis arrested Doc Barker outside his apartment at 432 Surf Street in Chicago. According to Purvis, when asked where his gun was, Barker drawled that it was at home and added that it was a hell of a place for it. In the apartment, investigators found a hand-drawn map circling the Florida Lake Cottage hideout of Ma and Fred Barker. 8 days later, on January 16, 1935, FBI agents surrounded the Barker cottage near Lake Weir, Florida. A 4-hour gunfight left both Ma and Fred dead. Doc was sentenced to life for the Bremer kidnapping and transferred to Alcatraz in the summer of 1935 as inmate number 268. On the rock, Barker became deeply withdrawn and bitter. He spent years in D-block isolation. By late 1938, working in the machine shop, he and a small group of accomplices had quietly fashioned saw blades out of copper, which the prison's metal detectors could not pick up, and concealed them inside doctored harmonicas. Plotting the breakout were Barker, Dale Stamphill, William Martin, Rufus McCain, and Henry Young. In the early hours of Friday, January 13, 1939, the men sawed through the bars of their D-block cells. They squeezed through the cell house window and used a homemade device to bend the exterior iron bars. The fog was perfect cover. The 5 made it to the west shore of the island and began lashing driftwood into a makeshift raft. By dawn, the guards had discovered the empty cells. Searchlights swept the shore, and the escapees were spotted. Ordered to surrender, Barker refused. He was reportedly still calmly tying timber together when guards opened fire. He was shot in the head and leg. According to inmate accounts, when guards reached him bleeding on the rocks, Doc Barker said he was crazy as hell and should never have tried it. He died of his wounds later that day, January 13, 1939, at age 39. Stamphill was wounded but survived. Martin, McCain, and Young were recaptured. Buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Tulsa next to his mother and brother Fred, Doc Barker is remembered not for his crimes, but for his failure. He got closer to freedom than almost anyone before him, only to discover that the ocean around Alcatraz was the real warden, and one of the men recaptured alongside him would soon commit a murder inside the prison that put Alcatraz itself on trial. Henry Young. If you have seen the 1995 film Murder in the First, starring Kevin Bacon, you think you know this story. A teenage orphan, sentenced to Alcatraz for stealing $5 to feed his sister, tortured in a dungeon for 3 years, who kills a snitch and dies in his cell after the trial. Almost none of that is true. The real Henry Young was a multiple murderer and serial bank robber, whose defense attorneys pulled off one of the most audacious legal strategies in American history. They did not try to prove he was innocent. They tried to prove Alcatraz made him do it. Henry Theodore Young was born June 20, 1911, in Kansas City, Missouri. Little is known of his early life beyond that he drifted into petty theft as a teenager and graduated to armed bank robbery in the early 1930s, known for taking hostages whom he reportedly brutalized. In 1933, while serving time in the Pacific Northwest, Young was convicted of a separate murder in Washington state. That fact is almost universally left out of popular retellings of his story. After stints in state prisons in Montana and Washington, and at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary in 1935, he was transferred to Alcatraz because of his escape history and violent disposition. Young was one of the 5 inmates in Doc Barker's January 13, 1939 escape attempt. After recapture, Young and Rufus McCain were placed in disciplinary segregation. Contrary to the famous story repeated in the film, Young was not held in a dungeon for years. Bureau of Prisons records show his post-escape segregation lasted only several months in a standard isolation cell with light, plumbing, and bedding. And he was returned to the general population no later than autumn 1939. On December 3, 1940, more than a year after his release from segregation, Young attacked Rufus McCain in the tailor shop of the Alcatraz Industries building, plunging a sharpened spoon handle into McCain's abdomen. McCain died hours later. According to Alvin Karpus and other inmates, Young blamed McCain for the failure of the escape because McCain had revealed at the last moment that he could not swim, slowing the raft construction. Others suggested a personal feud, possibly romantic. The two were widely rumored to be former lovers. Young's own remark moments afterward, that he hoped he had killed the man, was a centerpiece of the prosecution. The federal trial, United States versus Young, opened in San Francisco in April 1941. Young's defense, headed by attorneys Saul A. Abrams and James Martin McInnes, took an approach nobody expected. They put Alcatraz itself on trial. Calling 23 Alcatraz inmates to testify, the defense painted a portrait of routine brutality, sensory deprivation, and physical abuse in segregation. Psychiatrist Joseph Catton described the damage done by prolonged isolation. Young himself testified that he had seen only one man get a bath in solitary confinement in all the time he had been there, and that man had a bucket of cold water thrown over him. On April 25, 1941, after 11 hours of deliberation, The jury acquitted Young of first-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter, convicting him only of involuntary manslaughter. The jury also issued a statement that conditions concerning the treatment of prisoners at Alcatraz were unbelievably cruel and inhuman and urged a federal investigation. The judge called Young a cold-blooded murderer and imposed the maximum 3-year sentence. Bureau of Prisons Director James V. Bennett responded with a statement on May 1, 1941, declaring that the jury had been misled about conditions and had been impressed by tactics designed to free Young through attacking a public institution. Despite the publicity, no major reform followed. Young returned to Alcatraz and continued to cause trouble, setting fire to his own cell, throwing objects, threatening guards, and getting into fights with other inmates. In 1948, Young was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. In 1954, he was sent to Washington State Penitentiary at Walla Walla to serve out the life sentence from his earlier 1933 murder. He escaped briefly in 1967, landing him on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, and was arrested in Kansas City on January 9, 1968, after a citizen recognized him from a magazine. Paroled in 1972 at age 61, he immediately jumped parole and vanished. Washington state authorities never located him. He has been presumed dead for decades. The real Henry Young was far more morally ambiguous than anything Hollywood wrote. His defense brilliantly weaponized Alcatraz's reputation, and the jury bought it. Whether the conditions truly drove him to kill McCain, or whether he simply found a clever excuse will never be settled. What is settled is that one man on this island used a pencil and a paintbrush instead of a shiv, and his story could not be more different. John Paul Chase. On November 27, 1934, near Barrington, Illinois, a man named John Paul Chase opened fire on 2 FBI agents with a Monitor automatic rifle, pumping 5 rounds through their windshield. By the time the shooting stopped, both agents were dead or dying, and Chase's partner, Babyface Nelson, had been hit 17 times. Chase loaded Nelson's body into the agent's car and drove off into the night. He became the first man ever charged under the brand new federal law making the killing of a federal officer a capital offense. And then he spent the next 40 years becoming the quietest man Alcatraz had ever seen. John Paul Chase was born December 26, 1901, in San Francisco, California. He left school early to work on a ranch, then apprenticed as a machinist in a railroad yard before being fired in 1926. He drifted through California and Nevada, working as a chauffeur for professional gamblers, a bootlegger out of Sausalito, and briefly as an attendant at the Mount Shasta State Fish Hatchery in 1928. Around 1932, he met Lester Babyface Nelson in Sausalito, and they began a friendship that defined the rest of Chase's life. They moved bootleg liquor together, then graduated to armed bank robbery. On October 23, 1933, the pair pulled off their first major bank job in Brainerd, Minnesota, taking $32,000. By March 1934, Nelson had joined the John Dillinger gang, and Chase served as a gopher, running errands, acquiring weapons, carrying messages between Nelson and Dillinger. The FBI later concluded that on March 22, 1934, Chase and Nelson abducted and murdered Roy Fritsch, a federal witness in Reno, dumping his body down an abandoned mine shaft. The body was never found. Chase's confirmed work with the Dillinger gang included the June 30, 1934 robbery of a bank in South Bend, Indiana, during which a local police officer was killed. After Dillinger and Homer Van Meter were gunned down in the summer of 1934, Chase fled with Nelson to Reno, then back to Chicago. Then came the Battle of Barrington. On November 27, 1934, Chase Nelson and Helen Gillis, Nelson's wife, were intercepted by FBI Inspector Samuel P. Cowley and Special Agent Herman E. Hollis near Barrington, Illinois. Chase opened the gunfight, firing through the agent's windshield. Nelson and Chase poured rifle and Thompson fire into the FBI car. Agent Hollis was killed at the scene from a rifle round to the back of his head. Inspector Cowley, mortally wounded, died early the next morning. Nelson was hit 17 times, mostly by shotgun pellets, and died that evening. Chase loaded Nelson into the agent's commandeered car and drove off with Helen Gillis. Helen later left Nelson's body alongside the road and surrendered to police. Chase fled west on December 27, 1934. When he showed up at the Mount Shasta hatchery trying to borrow money from a former co-worker, the local chief of police arrested him without incident. Convicted of the murder of Inspector Cowley with a jury recommendation of mercy, Chase was sentenced to life imprisonment. On March 31, 1935, he was transferred to Alcatraz as inmate number 238. Chase served 19.5 years on the Rock, making him one of the longest-serving inmates in Alcatraz history, second only to Karpis. He was famously quiet. In stark contrast to inmates like Machine Gun Kelly, Chase boasted of nothing, made no enemies, and largely vanished into prison routine. He developed into a competent painter, completing a celebrated series of 10 artboard panels depicting a 180-degree panorama of San Francisco Bay from Telegraph Hill to Tiburon, as seen from the Alcatraz yard. He had earned the personal hatred of J. Edgar Hoover, whom he once described as a rat with a patriotic-sounding name. Hoover personally intervened to block Chase's first parole hearing in 1950 and ordered FBI surveillance of the Catholic prison chaplain, Father Joseph Clark, who had championed Chase's parole. In September 1954, Chase was transferred to Leavenworth. After repeated denials, parole finally came in 1966. He moved to Menlo Park, California, took a custodial supervisor job at St. Patrick's College Seminary, kept to himself, and painted in his spare time. Few neighbors knew his past. John Paul Chase died of colon cancer in Palo Alto on October 5, 1973, at age 71, attended at burial by a small handful of mourners. The quietest possible ending for a man who had once shot it out with the FBI on a Chicago suburban road. Chase proved that Alcatraz could do something nobody expected. It could make a man disappear while he was still alive. The last name on this list arrived on the Rock as the most feared man in America. He left it as a punchline. George Machine Gun Kelly. There is a phrase that every American knows: G-men. It is the slang term for FBI agents, and it has been used in movies, television, and headlines for nearly a century. According to the official FBI account, that phrase was invented on the night of September 26, 1933, when a terrified gangster named George Machine Gun Kelly was cornered in a Memphis bedroom and cried out for the agents not to shoot. The FBI has told that story for 90 years. The problem is, it almost certainly never happened that way. George Kelly Barnes was born July 18, 1895, in Memphis, Tennessee, into a respectable middle-class Irish-American family. He briefly attended Mississippi A&M, now Mississippi State University, in 1917 to study agriculture, where his highest grade was a C+, awarded for personal hygiene. He dropped out, married Geneva Ramsey, and tried to support a family driving a taxi while bootlegging on the side. To shield his family's name, he changed his to George R. Kelly. Multiple arrests for liquor violations followed, culminating in his February 11, 1928, sentencing to 3 years at Leavenworth for smuggling liquor onto an Indian reservation in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He served as a model inmate and was released early. Around 1930, Kelly met and married Catherine Thorne, a far more dangerous criminal than he was. It was Catherine who reportedly bought Kelly his first Thompson submachine gun, drilled him in marksmanship in the Texas countryside, and tirelessly promoted his name in underworld bars, building the Machine Gun Kelly legend largely from scratch. After a string of small bank robberies through 1932 to 33, Kelly and partner Albert Bates pulled off the crime that defined him. On the night of Saturday, July 22, 1933, they walked onto the front porch of Oklahoma City oilman Charles F. Urschel and abducted him along with his friend Walter R. Jarrett. They later released Jarrett, holding Urschel at the Texas farm of Catherine's mother and stepfather. They demanded $200,000, the largest ransom ever paid up to that time. The money was dropped off in Kansas City on July 30th. Urschel was released the following day, blindfolded but mentally cataloging every sound, oil pumps, an airplane overhead at specific times, and depositing fingerprints everywhere he could. The kidnapping was the first major case under the new Lindbergh Law of June 1933 that made kidnapping a federal crime. The FBI tracked the Kellys for 2 months. In the pre-dawn hours of September 26, 1933, agents raided a Memphis residence. According to the New York Herald Tribune's later account sourced from the FBI, Kelly was found cowering in a corner with no gun handy, his face twitching, whimpering, reaching his hands toward the ceiling, and begging the agents not to shoot, calling them G-men. Whether he actually said those words, or whether Hoover's press office embroidered the story afterward, has been debated ever since. What is not debated is that Kelly and Catherine were both sentenced to life imprisonment on October 12, 1933. Kelly was sent first to Leavenworth. Then, in response to his loud public threats to break out by Christmas and free his wife, transferred to Alcatraz, arriving September 4, 1934, with one of the prison's first big inmate groups. He became inmate number 117, working in the laundry, then in the industry's office as a clerk. He was, by every measure, a model inmate. Warden Johnston repeatedly described him as well-behaved. He became known for his fanatical love of yard bridge, playing in even the coldest weather, and his fondness for stories of the Old West. He boasted endlessly about robberies and murders he had never committed, irritating other prisoners. Willie Radke, who shared the cell next to him, later remembered Kelly reaching out of his cell to slap him in the head with a magazine whenever Radke snored. Inmates dubbed him Pop Gun Kelly. He turned to Bible study and sent a series of remorseful letters to Charles Urschel begging forgiveness. Urschel, who had received death threats against his family from the Kellys, never replied. In one letter, Kelly wrote that 5 words seemed written in fire on the walls of his cell, and those words were that nothing can be worth this. After nearly 17 years on the Rock, Kelly was quietly transferred back to Leavenworth on June 1, 1951, where he worked in the furniture factory. On the evening of July 16, 1954, he was admitted to the prison hospital complaining of chest pain. Shortly after midnight, on his 59th birthday, July 18, 1954, Kelly died of a massive heart attack. His body was claimed by Catherine's stepfather, who buried him in the family plot at Cottondale, Texas Cemetery, under a simple poured concrete stone marked George B. Kelly, 1954. Catherine was paroled in 1958 and lived quietly in Oklahoma City as a hospital bookkeeper until her death in 1985. His obituary carried the headline that Machine Gun Kelly had died, and that the kidnapper had coined the term G-men. A fitting last line for a small-time bootlegger whose wife and a single audacious kidnapping made him, briefly, the most feared name in America. 10 men. 10 different versions of what it meant to be locked inside the most feared prison in American history. Some were broken by the rock, some were refined by it, and a few walked out the other side as if it had never touched them. Their stories are closed, but Alcatraz is still standing. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.